The night before he became king, a teenage boy stood beside his father's burning funeral pyre and didn't cry, didn't tremble, didn't even blink, because in his mind, the flames were not destroying a king, they were clearing a throne. And that boy was Alexander of Macedon, a name that would soon travel farther than any army ever had before him, farther than maps, farther than myths, into lands people in Greece believed were ruled by monsters and gods. And he was only 20 years old when the crown fell onto his head like a challenge instead of a gift, because Macedonia was surrounded by enemies who thought a young ruler meant easy victory. But Alexander had been trained since childhood, not like a prince, but like a weapon, tutored by Aristotle himself, who filled his mind with philosophy, science, poetry, and the idea that greatness was not inherited, but taken. And when rebellions exploded the moment his father Philip II died, Alexander didn't negotiate or wait. He marched instantly, crushing revolts with speed that shocked even his own generals, destroying the city of Thebes so completely that the smoke became a warning signal to every Greek state thinking of rebellion. And suddenly, the boy was no longer seen as inexperienced. He was seen as inevitable, a force that didn't pause, didn't hesitate. And once Greece was under his control, his gaze moved east toward the Persian Empire, the largest and richest empire on earth, ruled by King Darius III, a ruler with more soldiers, more gold, and more territory than Alexander could even count. Yet Alexander didn't see size, he saw opportunity, because to him, Persia wasn't unconquerable, it was unfinished. And in 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont with an army far smaller than Persia's, but fueled by belief so intense it made men march into impossible odds. And before his first major battle, he visited the ruins of Troy, honoring ancient heroes as if he already knew history would place his name beside them. Then, at the Battle of the Granicus River, he charged personally into enemy lines, nearly dying in the chaos, but surviving through sheer aggression and loyalty from his companions. And that moment set the tone for every campaign after, because Alexander never ruled from behind safety. He fought in front, bled with his soldiers, slept on the ground beside them. And this wasn't just strategy, it was psychological domination, making his men believe he was destined to win, and making his enemies fear he could not be stopped. And as city after city fell, he didn't just conquer with swords, he used diplomacy, marriages, cultural respect, and ruthless destruction when needed, blending mercy and terror so unpredictably that resistance often collapsed before battle even began. And by the time he marched deeper into Asia Minor, the world realized this wasn't a temporary invasion, it was the beginning of something that would permanently reshape civilization. When Alexander met Darius III on the battlefield at Issus, it wasn't just two armies clashing, it was two visions of the world colliding. Darius with his massive forces stretching across the plains like a moving wall, Alexander with precision and speed slicing through formations like lightning. And despite being outnumbered, Alexander targeted the center, aiming directly for Darius himself, because he understood that breaking the king would break the empire. And when Darius fled, abandoning his chariot and leaving his family behind, the psychological shock echoed across Persia, turning the invincible empire into something suddenly fragile. And Alexander didn't just seize territory, he captured Darius's mother, wife, and daughters. Yet instead of humiliating them, he treated them with royal respect, a move that spread stories of his honor alongside his brutality, creating a reputation so complex that enemies didn't know whether to fear him or admire him. And then came Tyre, a coastal fortress city built on an island, protected by walls rising straight from the sea, considered impossible to conquer. But Alexander refused the word impossible, ordering the construction of a massive causeway through the ocean itself, turning water into land through sheer engineering will. And after months of relentless siege, Tyre fell, its resistance crushed so completely that the message traveled across continents that Alexander didn't stop for geography, nature, or logic. He altered reality to win. And when he entered Egypt, he wasn't seen as a conqueror, but as a liberator from Persian rule, crowned as a pharaoh and founding the city of Alexandria, which would become a beacon of knowledge and trade for centuries, showing that Alexander didn't only destroy cities, he built legacies. And yet his ambition kept pulling him forward, deeper into the heart of Persia, where the final confrontation with Darius awaited, a clash that would decide not just territory, but history itself. The Battle of Gaugamela was not just a military encounter, it was the moment the world tilted. Darius, assembling an enormous army on a vast plain chosen specifically to neutralize Alexander's tactical advantages, chariots with blades attached to their wheels, war elephants, endless infantry, while Alexander studied the terrain like a chessboard, positioning his forces with calculated precision. And when the battle began, it was chaos on a scale the ancient world had never seen. Dust clouds swallowing sunlight, screams blending with metal, and once again Alexander aimed straight for Darius, cutting through lines with his companion cavalry in a daring maneuver that felt closer to madness than strategy. But madness worked. Darius fled again, and with that retreat, the Persian Empire effectively collapsed, its capitals falling one by one, its treasures filling Alexander's coffers beyond imagination. Yet victory didn't slow him down. It transformed him, because now he wasn't just a king, he was ruler of the largest empire the world had ever known, stretching from Greece to Egypt to the edges of India. And with power came change. He began adopting Persian customs, wearing their clothing, encouraging intermarriage between cultures, trying to fuse East and West into a single civilization, a vision centuries ahead of its time, but deeply unpopular with his Macedonian generals who feared losing their identity. Tensions grew, friendships fractured, and even loyalty began to crack under the weight of endless campaigns. But Alexander pressed onward into India, where his army, exhausted after years of war, finally reached its psychological limit. Facing unfamiliar climates, massive rivers, and fierce resistance, his soldiers refused to march further. And for the first time, Alexander encountered a barrier he couldn't conquer with courage or tactics, the human limit of his own men. Forced to turn back, Alexander began the long return journey through brutal deserts where heat and thirst killed thousands. Yet he shared the same suffering as his troops, refusing special treatment, reinforcing their loyalty even as exhaustion hollowed them. And when he returned to Babylon, plans already forming for new conquests into Arabia and beyond, destiny intervened, not with an enemy army, but with illness, sudden and mysterious, leaving the man who had survived countless battles powerless in his own bed. And at just 32 years old, Alexander the Great died without a clear heir, leaving behind an empire too vast and too fragile to hold itself together, his generals dividing it into pieces through wars that lasted decades. Yet even as his empire fractured, his influence didn't. Cities bearing his name flourished, Greek culture spread across continents, science, language, and trade intertwined between East and West in ways that permanently reshaped history. And what makes Alexander unforgettable isn't just the land he conquered, but the idea he planted, that one individual with relentless belief, strategic genius, and fearless action could bend the course of the world before even reaching middle age, a legacy both inspiring and haunting, because his story isn't only about glory, it's about the cost of ambition, the loneliness at the top, and the truth that even those who seem larger than life still answer to time. And that is why centuries later his name still echoes, not as a myth, not as a legend, but as proof that history can be rewritten by someone bold enough to refuse the limits everyone else accepts.